Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 130 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be reviewing the new Ridley Scott movie, Exodus, Gods, and Kings. And this will involve spoilers, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by two guests. So first up, we've got Robert M. Price. He's a former Baptist minister who holds PhDs in systematic theology and the New Testament. He's the author of such books as The Amazing Colossal Apostle, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, and Killing History, Jesus in the No-Spin Zone, a refutation of Bill O'Reilly's book, Killing Jesus. Bob is also the host of the podcasts The Bible Geek and The Lovecraft Geek. So Bob, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks. Great to be here.
And also joining us today is Richard Carrier. He holds a PhD in ancient history from Columbia, and is the author of such books as Not the Impossible Faith, Proving History, and On the Historicity of Jesus, which argues that Jesus Christ may never have existed. So Richard, welcome to the show.
Hello, yeah, great to be here.
All right, so I'm really happy to have Bob and Richard back on the show. They also joined us back in episode 108 to review Darren Aronofsky's movie Noah, and that was one of our most popular discussions ever, so definitely go check that out if you missed it. But now let's talk about Exodus, Gods, and Kings. Now, this is definitely not the first movie to tackle the story of Moses. So Bob, why don't we start with you and have you just tell us what other movies have tackled this story before, and what did you think of them?
Well, I absolutely love the Charlton Heston, Yul Brynner 10 Commandments. That had a real sense of the mythic, epic character of the whole story. There's not naturalistic color as there is in Gods and Kings. There is this great technicolor. Moses has this impossible hairdo that looks just like the old pictures and sculptures of him, and that's exactly as it should be. I think that it just got everything right. It just shows, in fact, I would say that the 10 Commandments is the definitive version of the Exodus, more so than the Bible. So I wonder why the heck anybody ever thought to do another Moses movie. But there was one in the 70s with Burt Lancaster, which I don't remember much about, but I saw it at the time, and I thought that they made one big mistake here. They're trying to make it look as if it might have happened, and it just fell flat in my subjective opinion. And I'd say the same problem attaches to this one, though it is spectacular to look at, and yet it seemed to me it didn't do well. There are creative changes from the Bible, like the notion that Moses, having been a general for Pharaoh, as Josephus has, when he decided to try to set Israel free, he decided to do it by conventional means, a war of attrition, and then God says, now we don't need to do that, and then the plagues start. It's interesting, but it's not an interesting variation in the way the Noah movie was. And eventually I figured, well, everybody knows what's coming here. It just became tedious to me, and I guess this is subjective.
But I think everything Bob said sounds completely correct to me in terms of my evaluation of Exodus, Gods, and Kings. I mean, I have even harsher things to say, I think, about it, even aesthetically, cinematically, just in terms of as a movie. I thought it was the worst Ridley Scott film ever made, frankly. But apparently, I guess there was 4 hours of film, and he was forced to cut it down to 2.5. And that explains a lot of the things I had problems with it, is where they had these interesting storylines that they just dropped, and this did nothing with them. And it just seemed very, like, badly written. Like, there's very little character development. There are characters like Sigourney Weaver's character that's just, she seems to have no purpose in the film, and I'm sure there must be like a half an hour of footage of scenes with her that they just cut or something. I mean, it's just an edit hatchet job, really. So there's just lots of things wrong with it, and a lot of all the interesting stuff. I thought it was the funny thing is, I was getting into it when I was watching it. I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. All the stuff they're making up, this backstory about Moses and Pharaoh being together, being, buddies and, basically sort of not adopted brothers, but practically. And this whole thing. But That was a great storyline, and having the storyline with the viceroy and his elite corruption and, living voluptuously while the slaves were suffering, and the whole social justice to Moses, like, that was an interesting storyline, but then they just completely dropped it and went nowhere with it. And it's like all these things were cool, but as soon as it started tracking the Bible, then it just got stupid and boring. It was just like we have to do the 10 plagues, let's plod through these. It was that kind of feeling. And then even when they got to the big scene, of course, the crossing of the Red Sea and the great tidal wave and all of that stuff, they completely ruined it with this sort of hack writer concept of they get down to just Moses and Pharaoh by themselves in this sort of Mexican standoff with swords. And as soon as that happened, it's like, come on, what is this, a sci-fi movie? I mean, this is like, sci-fi sci-fi movie. Yeah. The terrible, it's just a terrible way to write this narrative. It's like, that's so cliche. And then, of course, when the wave kills everybody, the only two people to swim to the surface and survive are Moses and Pharaoh, even though this huge tidal wave, like, crushes their bodies. Like, you visually see it. It would liquefy any actual human. But no, they're the only ones that survive. And it was just so, like, oh, come on. It's these kinds of writing decisions that were just really dumb, cliche things. It was just very lazy. And there's a lot of that throughout the movie.
Okay, so I guess there's going to be a lot to criticize here. So let's start at the very beginning with the title crawl stuff, which presents this idea that the Jewish people are slaves in Egypt and they're building the pyramids and all these great monuments. Richard, as a historian, how historically accurate is this basic setup?
Well, as history, it's not accurate at all. We have actually no evidence that the Jews were ever slaves in Egypt. So that's just something that was made up in Jewish literature centuries later. So no, I mean, even in terms of like displaying Egyptian history and stuff, it was very simplistic and anachronistic in the way they did it, which that in itself doesn't bug me so much. I was much more annoyed as a connoisseur of cinema at just the bad writing and the lousy character development and all of that. It kind of failed as history, but more importantly, it failed as a representation of the biblical text, because there's a lot of really cool stories in Exodus that they didn't have at all, like the wizard battle in Pharaoh's court, right? It's things like that, just not in there. And they're trying to have it both ways, like trying to make it the miracles be naturalistically explained, but then as naturalistic explanations, they make no scientific sense. So they can't, it's like they couldn't decide whether to go full miracle or full realistic naturalistic explanation. And so they tried to hedge the line in between, and it made it kind of terrible. They should have gone one or the other.
Yeah, this movie does have kind of a strange relationship with rationalism, and we see Moses at the beginning of the movie being sort of a rationalist skeptic.
Yeah.
How is that completely anachronistic? Would there have been rationalists in the court of the Pharaoh in biblical times?
That's a good question. I was thinking about that too. Especially when they have Moses, like Moses is the skeptic until he has the vision of the little petulant godchild. And then he's a believer, and then it's his wife who's trying to convince him that it was just a delusion from getting hit on the head with a rock. And I thought that was like exactly the reverse of what would have happened in any real conversation, because the way they depicted it, Moses was a highly educated elite, and she was your average shepherd girl who would have no education at all. And so for him to have gone up on the sacred mountain and to come down with this vision of God, she would be the one trying to convince him that it was real, and he's the one who would be trying to argue that it was the rock hitting him on the head. So it was kind of the reverse of how things would work in antiquity. With the question of were there rationalists like that, I can't say whether there would have been in 1300 BC. We don't have the kind of records, I think. Although there is evidence of rationalistic thinking in some of the early Sumerian literature of the same period, so it's entirely plausible. And when we get to Greece and Rome, of course, we have like a lot of the elite would rationalize away miracles and things like that, and use the exact same kind of discussion of stuff. But it was the educated elite who were able to think in these terms because they had more experience and knowledge with it. But the average person on the street would like, oh, you saw God and he spoke to you? That must be for real. It was that would have been the order of things. And they didn't quite get that right. And I thought that was strange. And it was also, again, to get to the whole idea of not following the Bible, they had this whole storyline with Moses being all angsty about leaving his family behind, which is weird because in the Exodus story, he takes his family with him. And I don't understand why they changed that. I mean, it was strange.
Would it be safe, Richard, for if there were rationalists, could they just poo-poo the augurs and that kind of stuff the way that Moses does here without facing any repercussions like blasphemy charges or anything like that?
Oh, well, again, I can't speak to 1300 BC Egypt. I don't know what kind of laws or principles they had then. My expertise is Greco-Roman period. And then, yes, for sure, you could get away with that. The things that would get you into trouble, and only in some cases, and it would depend on the environment. Like in Athens, there was a kind of democratic hostility towards teaching that the gods don't exist. So that's what Socrates got on the bad end of that stick, for example. But that's actually an outlier. When you see like the Roman period, the idea you have Cicero writing this whole treatise about him being an augur himself, and basically trying to toe the line between, well, it's all baloney, but but it serves an important social function. It was very Confucian of him to say that. But it's very clear that he himself was a practicing augur, but didn't believe a thing of it. Like, he was a total rationalist. He didn't think that was real. But he would also at the same time endorse kind of these Stoic attempts to kind of rationalistically explain how augury could actually work somehow. But I don't even think he bought it. And I don't think you'd get into too much trouble pulling that, really, necessarily. But you would have this variety of belief in the augurs as to how much you would trust them. But there are famous stories that tried to combat that skepticism. You have a famous one in the history of Rome where one of these Roman generals got sick of the augurs and thought it was baloney. And it was they used to do augury with chickens, and the behavior of the chickens, how the chickens would eat or not, would tell them things. And it was a question of, it would be good luck if the chicken ate or something like that. And the chickens wouldn't eat, and this general was absolutely certain that they were going to be victorious. And he says, well, then let the chickens drink. And they threw them in the ocean to drown the chickens. And then, of course, they lose, and it's like, oh, the augury works. But, of course, that's myth, right? So they make up that story specifically to sell augury as a genuine thing.
Well, I mean, Bob, for people who aren't so familiar with the Exodus story in the Bible, could you just talk about a bit about the awesome wizard duel that Richard was talking about, and how the setup of this movie was different from what we would read in Exodus?
Well, God gives Moses signs to convince the Israelites, who appear not to have remembered their God, as the movie says, because Moses even says, who do I say sent me? Even he doesn't know. Who am I talking to here? And he gives them the I am thing, and he says, tell them that Yahweh has sent you, and this ought to convince him. And he is able to whiten his skin as if he has leprosy, and then return it to normal. And his shepherd staff turns into a snake, and so forth. Very much like a Zoroaster story, where he's about to go see Prince Vistashpa, and is given the ability by Ahura Mazda to create fireballs, and that convinces him. Well, he does this, and then does some of the same stuff to convince Pharaoh. And the great thing is that this is so ironic in odd ways, that he casts the staff down and it turns into a serpent. But the sorcerer priests of Pharaoh are able to do the same thing with their staffs. And there's no embarrassment there that, they have magic powers, but God has more. And so then Moses' serpent staff eats all the other ones. And not only is it hilarious, but to see what fundamentalists do with this is really a scream. I guess I shouldn't beat on them like this, but they're rationalists when on everything else but orthodox stuff in the Bible, and cannot bring themselves to admit that Pharaoh's magicians could have done this. And so they're uncomfortable even with Moses having a morphing staff like this. So I've actually read more than once, they say, well, what Moses did was to throw his staff on the floor, and no one had noticed before this point that it was a stuffed, rigid snake made into a staff. I mean, that fundamental. It's like they don't want to believe Leviathan and Behemoth are like kaijus in the Bible. And say, well, really, that's a crocodile and an ox and so forth. It's very bizarre. Like miracles, oh yeah, full speed ahead. But these other weird things, or satyrs mentioned in Isaiah, no, that's just goats. And it's very odd. So there's again that kind of weird waffling and on both sides of the supernaturalism issue. I don't, and so I can imagine them putting that into this movie, but they seemed a little too, like, for instance, God doesn't simply appear out of the burning bush. You're really left with the option of thinking that maybe it is just some wise kid, or he's just having hallucinations. I guess they figured if you pulled like the miracle contest thing, kind of like Peter and Simon Magath in early,
Yeah.
sure that would just be too absurd to the modern viewer.
Okay, so you guys mentioned that this movie, it presents Moses as if he grew up as the best friend of the Pharaoh and is one of his army generals. How much basis does that have in the Bible, and if not, where else might they have gotten it from?
Well, I'd be curious. Bob mentioned Josephus says something about this.
Yeah, that Moses, since Pharaoh must have thought he was an Egyptian, and it's not clear whether he understood that his daughter had adopted a baby, though not knowing that he wouldn't have known it was a Hebrew baby, or if he somehow thought that it was his own natural grandson. You'd think the former, but it never really says. And then the fact that this Pharaoh dies before Moses is an adult and is contesting with the Pharaoh, that they figure, well, Moses and this Pharaoh, Ramesses, it's thought, would have grown up in Pharaoh's house. It's very likely they would have been pretty much brothers or foster brothers, which is a reasonable inference, but it never says anything like that. I kept thinking of Thor and Loki from the Thor movies. It's almost exactly the same idea and the same, the rivalry and yet love between them and so on.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's all. They inserted all that. That's not from the Bible.
Mm.
Okay, well, Bob, you mentioned Moses whitening his skin, and there was a whole bunch of skin whitening going on in this movie. I mean, yeah, I guess a lot has been said about this, but I don't know. What did you guys think about the casting of almost exclusively Caucasian actors for the main parts in this movie?
Well, they did for the main parts. I mean, they threw in some mixed race people, various races, and the sort of random people who die here and there, right? But yeah, all the leads are your stock white people. In this day and age, I mean, there's so many great actors of various races that would not. There's no reason to do that. I mean, there's huge big name actors you could cast. Black actors, for example, that would be draws, box office draws, and that was their excuse, is they needed box office draws. And come on, there's lots of black actors who would be big draws. So they totally could. Now, in reality, the race of Egyptians was very diverse. I mean, they were like, their average skin color would have been, midway between white and black, but there would have been people of all different colors because it was really a trade center. There was a lot of interracial marriage going on in Egypt. So their races would be all over the place, but to have every single lead character totally on the white end would not be historically accurate at all.
They should have made Idris Elba Pharaoh.
Oh, yeah, right? Yeah.
Though the guy they picked, I thought, looked and acted well for the kind of Pharaoh they made him. He wasn't a strong man like Yul Brynner. He was sort of he didn't have much motivation beyond narcissism and cruelty, and I thought that was done well, but I couldn't get over the fact that he looked like Cameron Diaz in a bald wig. I thought, what, is that her? It amazingly distracted me, but I thought it was good.
Yeah, well, I mean, Richard mentioned too. I mean, it was really distracting. Not only were so many of the leading roles white actors, but they were white actors that you recognize. Really, it's sort of in your face that you're trying to suspend disbelief and believe that this is this court in ancient Egypt, and every actor is somebody you recognize and somebody who's white. And the casting was just kind of a train wreck.
Yeah. So it would have been far more interesting if they'd done it in a more realistic way. And I think would have gotten a bigger audience draw, I would expect, right? It would have, instead of getting criticism, because you know how Rupert Murdoch, the film got criticized for this, and Rupert Murdoch gotten sort of a Twitter battle over it, where he said, it's like, well, since when are Egyptians not white? Well, all the Egyptians I know are white. And it's like,
Ooh, boy.
yeah, well, you're Rupert Murdoch, of course. You're kind of being selective who you hang out with. But anyway, no, but that kind of thing turned out badly for them. Whereas if they had gone with a more diverse cast, I think then they would have been getting praise for it rather than criticism, would have gotten the movie more attention. And, why not? I just don't see why they would be so obsessed with going all white cast.
Okay, I mean, Bob, you mentioned that the Pharaoh, I mean, he was interesting as a character in one sense in that at least I genuinely believe that he loved his son.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that from the Bible, or was that did they enhance that for the movie?
Yeah, they did. They may have gotten the idea from Yul Brynner and his reaction to the death of his son in the canonical version. But I think the seed for that is that when Moses makes the threat that this is what's going to happen if you don't let us go, the firstborn from the most humble shepherd to Pharaoh himself is going to feel this. And so I guess they figure, yeah, that is too good to leave out, so we got to do something with it and have a reaction, and that's a pretty good adaptation, I think.
Yeah, that plays into what I was thinking, like in terms of the backstory they made up, the fiction they made up to like the first 30, 40 minutes of the film, I was like, oh, this could be a good movie. This is quite interesting. And it's just right at that point, by the time they got him connected with the shepherd's life, and then they started going on track with the Bible, that's when it got just sort of stupid and boring for me. And where the narratives just started falling apart, and it was a lot of time wasting and stuff. That's when the movie started to get disappointing, and it was exactly when I expected the movie to get more interesting, right? So it was just bad writing, I think.
Though, as you point out, if they cut out an hour and a half of it, who knows what it might have been so different that it could have made more sense and been more interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, although that doesn't explain everything. Like when they have, like you look at the Bible in Exodus, when Moses murders the Egyptian guard, Exodus gives a reason for that. He sees a guard beating a slave, and then he's driven to kill the beater of the slave. Like you have a whole, slavery, oppression, social justice narrative there that actually makes a lot of sense, even resonates today. Yeah. But in the movie, they didn't have any explanation. He was just, Moses himself was walking along, a guard mistook him for a slave and just said, hey, stop, yo, slave, stop. And I think one guy hits him not even very hard on the back because he wasn't stopping. And he turns around and kills the other guy, like not even the guy who hit him, and just kills him. And you're like, why did Moses just kill that guy? Like, these guys are, like, working for Moses. Like, he could have turned around and said, hey, it's me, it's Moses. Like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I was puzzled by that, too.
It made no sense.
The dropping of the ball with the good dramatic stuff in the original, because Moses says, hey, I am a Hebrew. I can't live with this, and kills the guy. And then the next day he goes out again and sees two Hebrews fighting and says, hey, you guys are both Hebrews. You shouldn't be fighting. Oh, you're going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian the other day? Uh-oh. I mean, that is great, but not in the movie.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, there are a lot of good stories in the original material that they just didn't adapt at all. And what they did adapt was just completely messed up. It didn't make any sense as writing.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the 10 plagues. I guess in some previous movies, they've cut out some of the plagues because they figured 10 was really kind of overkill.
It is a bit, yeah.
I guess, Bob, what did you think of the decision to include all 10 plagues in this movie?
Well, they did do it pretty quickly. It could have been more tedious than it was. So I didn't mind that too much, but that meant that they couldn't have the back and forth between Pharaoh and Moses, which is kind of interesting when that no matter what is happening, Egypt is coming down around the Pharaoh's ears and he won't let him go. And the fact that God tells Moses in advance, look, you're going to go demand freedom, I will harden his heart. So he's irrationally stubborn. And again, he's making Pharaoh into a punching bag so the nations will know that I am the Lord and all that. That's a really interesting thing, but it's gone totally. In the Charlton Heston version, they kind of rationalized it and made it believable that he was so pig-headed about it, and it worked. But he had the Moses Pharaoh interaction. Almost none of that here, and it's especially strange since they made more of a connection between Moses and Pharaoh.
Yeah. And then that gets into the whole trying to have it both ways with the miracles and not. I mean, the naturalistic explanations just were not plausible at all. I mean, they said that, the numbers of frogs that were plaguing them made no sense because those frogs the only way those frogs could exist is if the mommy and daddy frogs were zillions of them and had shit to eat. And it's like, what were they eating? So it's like, how could you have that many frogs? It's not possible to have that many frogs. But then when the frogs all die, then the flies or the maggots grow in the frogs, and that's what explained the flies. But then they had the plague that killed all the animals, all the livestock, but suddenly there's no flies, like maggots don't like cow meat anymore. It was, even scientifically, it didn't make sense.
Actually, Richard, speaking of, I mean, the Egyptians, they had this scientific advisor who was attempting to explain all the plagues, basically in scientific terms.
Oh, that was great. I really did like that.
Yeah. And I think he says that it's like a new theory or something at the time that insects spread plague.
Yeah.
That's
true. That's a good catch. Well, again, I can't speak to what was being theorized 1300 BC in Egypt. But by the time of the early Roman Empire, yes, there were some people theorizing that there were essentially what we would call microorganisms that were not visible to the human eye that could be transmitted through physical means, through gnats or other objects and stuff. So they had a contamination theory based, and they would even call these small things invisible, like animals that were smaller than the human eye could see. So there were people like with a primitive germ theory, and it was a theory, like no one had proved it. But it was going around, and you have like Plutarch who writes about medicine, and he includes it as, this is one of many theories of where disease comes from. It's as plausible as any. So that did exist then. I don't know if it would have existed in 1300 BC, but it's at least plausible enough that if, we don't have any literature from the period on it, why not throw that in there? I mean, that would at least be plausible to have that going on. So that didn't offend me as a historian in any case.
All right, so what did you guys think? I mean, Richard mentioned the decision to make God or God's messenger or whatever this 11-year-old boy in this movie. What did you guys think of that decision?
They didn't do anything with it. I mean, they really made him into like a petulant, angry, kind of immature child. Like the way he acted and everything is like, whoa, who would want to follow this God?
Well, that's the way God is in the Old Testament often.
Yeah, but you would play on that, right? You would make that a point of the film, and you would develop it. And they just really didn't. It's like it was just a throwaway thing. It was just a thing that happened in the film. And rather than developing something like a narrative about this, like, oh, like God is really like this, or doing something with it, they just didn't do really anything with it. It was just sort of a throwaway interaction between this little child God and Moses.
It's not unbiblical exactly, because possibly in the Gospel of Mark and in various, I think the Acts of John and other early Christian apocrypha, you have the idea that at least Christ or an angel appears as a child, and that struck me as kind of saving it. But again, I think it was.
Oh yeah. That reminds me, too, because this goes back to the stuff they must have cut out, because there is a line in the movie where Moses says he's tired of talking to God's messenger. He says that to the kid. But they never developed that. That was just like a line left in, but they clearly must have developed that point at some scene that they cut out, where this is like the Metatron or something. It's the angel who speaks for God. Because that's in later Jewish lore, God could never speak to you because it would just vaporize your body if you heard God's voice. So God could only speak to you through angels. So every time you saw God or spoke to him, you were really speaking to God's messenger, and it was usually the Metatron or one of these archangels. The movie Dogma makes fun of this, but it's an actual part of Jewish angelology. And so it looks like that was a part of the movie, explaining that this kid is just this archangel that is the messenger of God. But who knows how much of that stuff ended up on the cutting room floor? And the only hint of it is this one line that Moses says, and it's like, "Well, wait a minute, this kid's a messenger? You didn't establish that. What's going on?" Yeah. And Moses knows it? Like, where did that happen? I missed that. Bad editing, I guess, in that case. Bad decisions as to what to cut, but maybe they had no choice.
You do at least have the boy the first time appear beside the burning bush, whereas in the Bible the voice comes from the bush. But then later on, as you say, the rabbis, well, even biblical authors are saying, nah, it must have been the angel of the Lord. And so you have that like redactional thing to distance God from it. He's too transcendent for that. But you're right, you're left guessing what is going on here.
Okay, so then there's the line when Pharaoh shows his boy's body to Moses, and he says something to the effect of, what kind of fanatic would follow a god who would do something like this? Yeah. What did you guys think of that moment in the movie?
I mean, again, if they'd done something with it, like having Pharaoh say that after he had just been killing all kinds of kids and families and stuff, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because this would be more like a guy'd say, "Wow, your God is awesome." It's like, he can kill more kids than I can. This is great. Yeah. But to suddenly have Pharaoh be like this humanistic philosopher suddenly doesn't fit. Like, I can see how that you can build the contradiction in a character like that, but you'd have to build that contradiction. Like, it'd have to be explicable, or it'd have to be something about the conflict and the character that you play on narratively, or something like that. It's just bad cinema to just suddenly have him flip from suddenly from a tyrant has no trouble killing people to get his way, to suddenly being this humanistic philosopher who thinks that's barbaric. Doesn't make a lot of sense. So again, that's just bad writing in that case, I think.
I mean, certainly just killing innocent children seems like pretty much the prototypical example of something that's not morally justified, right? But this is God doing this in this story. I mean, how do you think that religious people reading this story through the ages dealt with that or made sense of that?
Well, I mean, the way they make sense of it, of course, in Exodus originally is that, well, the original Pharaoh, the earlier Pharaoh, killed the firstborn of the Jews, therefore it's just recompense to kill all the firstborn of the Egyptians. But that's just like, Pakistani villages, when a girl gets raped, the punishment is to go rape the sister of the rapist. Yeah. It's like that's not justice at all, right? That's actually quite horrible. So the justice makes no sense internally, but it did make sense in the medieval mindset, the primitive mindset of this time. But how do religious people now explain it? Because they can't really consistently say, "Oh yeah, it's totally justified to kill innocent kids of people who had nothing whatsoever to do with killing other innocent kids." I mean, I don't see how they hook it up, but maybe run into some justifications, Bob?
Well, implicitly, and that's all I can say. I've never heard them actually wrestle with it, but I suspect they would say what they do about hell, which of course is even much more fiendish, where they say, look, God doesn't just stick you in hell. He's giving you the option of getting out of it, and he wants you to get out of it. If you're there, it's your fault. And the same thing here. Moses told Pharaoh, you can avoid this in a simple way by letting us get the heck out of here. And he doesn't. Well, look, you were warned. But that doesn't exactly fly, because, again, in the Bible, God says he is going to make Pharaoh's heart so hard that he'll be irrational in his stubbornness. So God has predestined the whole situation. And I suspect, as with the slaughter of the Canaanites, which never happened, but it does in the Bible, they don't view them as real human beings. It's like the orcs in Lord of the Rings. They're just a race of evil, and so really, who the hell cares what happens to them?
Well, that brings up one of the anachronisms, I thought, in the film Exodus, Gods and Kings, where they made it out as being that they'll get the Egyptian people to persuade Pharaoh to change his mind, as if this was a democracy. Like, that's not how ancient Egypt worked. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, why kill the firstborn of these people who are living under a tyranny, who don't even get to elect their leader? They have no say whatsoever in what Pharaoh does. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. Like, they can't really be blamed for the original Pharaoh killing the sons of the Jews, because most of the Egyptians would have either had nothing to do with it, or they would have been under the gun, essentially. Like, you couldn't refuse to do it. What are you gonna? Well, what's gonna happen? You're gonna get killed by Pharaoh. So this is a tyranny, and so it's sort of punishing kids who had nothing to do with it, of people under a tyranny who have very little or that they can do. Doesn't make any sense morally. So it seems to me like this would be an exceedingly difficult thing to struggle with for someone of a modern moral mindset. And you see that in the way that they're treating, like, the line they throw into Pharaoh's mouth that you mentioned earlier, but also Moses, like, saying, oh, this is horrible, why would I follow a God who does this? But they don't go anywhere with that. Like, they don't do anything with it. So it's like they have, like, just the hint of something interesting that could have happened in terms of conversation or something, but it doesn't go anywhere in the movie, and that's just so disappointing.
I mean, it seems like maybe they want to go in that direction. I mean, there's the shot of that kid in front of us, the clouds gathering, where, I mean, he looks like the kid out of The Ring. I mean, he's so freaking scary. And I can't believe you would put that shot together and not, intend that this is you're telling a story about an evil God, but maybe, you don't want to hammer on that, because then it's going to alienate a giant portion of the audience. So you're kind of left in with this weird muddle of no point of view at all.
Yeah, exactly. You can't do that. You have to pick a lane. Like, you have to do something with it. And I think, like, if they'd done that, like, this God is creepy and scary. Like, they'd turn, Yahweh into, like, Cthulhu or something, and made the Jews into, like, a Cthulhu cult. That at least would make it, like, terrifying in that sense. You could make a horror movie out of Exodus quite easily. But of course, you have to be committed to doing that. Like, that has to be, like, this is my message as an artist to do this.
I mean, do you guys think it's possible could you do a version of the Exodus story that was more or less faithful to the events of the Bible, but a modern person would still look at the actions of God and say, and have God seem heroic somehow?
No.
Yeah, that's tough to imagine. Because you can't get away from the fact that God's taken it out on, he's making the Egyptian firstborn and really all of Egypt into a whipping boy, and he's preventing them from repenting. So it really just, and he does all this to glorify his own name, which is the real purpose of this. Like, when they get out of Egypt and Moses' father-in-law comes to the camp, and he says, wow, I've heard what happened. Your God really is the God, all right. That's kind of the point, that God shows his greatness, and the people, well, it's just like you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs.
Okay, so right before the death of the firstborn, Moses and the Jews protect themselves by painting their doors with lamb's blood. Is there some sort of story, like explanation for that?
Well, yeah. Like, one of the most important stories in the entire book of Exodus that they just cut out. I was astonished by that, because I was thinking, like I approached Noah, and I think Noah was a much better movie than this on many levels, like almost every level. Noah actually didn't assume that there's only a few things that they didn't explain. Like, most of the stuff they assumed you didn't know the story, and so they put some explanation in it or made stuff mysterious. Whereas in this, they had a few things that they just didn't explain at all. And I expect a movie to treat it like a fantasy source material, like you're doing Lord of the Rings or something, where even though the audience might already know the story, you have to include it as just part of the narrative. But they never explained, like, why is he telling them to put the lamb's blood on the doors? Like, what's the point of that? Maybe that's another scene that got cut. But you have to really include that. You can't just assume the audience knows this, especially today in this global society where a lot of people don't know that story, right?
Yeah.
It's you just can't assume everybody does. But yeah, it's the whole Passover narrative, right? Is that that God told Moses that the only thing that would protect the firstborn children from the angel of death that God would send to go slay all of the children is if you mark your doors with the blood of the lamb. And this mark the angel would come and would see this mark and would pass over your household and not kill your children. And that's the whole Passover narrative. It's the whole fundamental foundation of one of the most important holy days in Jewish religion. It's funny. It's like you're basically just saying, oh, we don't care about the Jewish audience. We're not going to play this. We're not going to explain Passover or any of that. We'll just cut that out. It just seemed like another example of just bad decision-making in terms of how to write or edit the film.
Plus, you have to think, if God is all powerful, what does he need to do this for? I mean, like, he does. They don't spread lamb's blood on the Israelite cows, and they're all
yes, that's right.
And this originally is, of course, an attempt to sanctify and provide a Jewish religious pedigree for what was and remains today in the Middle East a common practice, where when a new house or building is erected, you sacrifice a goat or a lamb or whatever, and brush blood on the lintels, the lintel and the doorposts, to sort of say to the grim reaper, I gave it the office. There has been a death here. You can skip us. And because if you don't, it may be a family member. And this superstition still goes on. And it survives almost entirely intact in the Bible, because what does it avert? The destroyer. What is that? Well, we think of, well, the angel of death, as if that's really any different. It's still the mysterious superstition, the supernatural stuff that is just dragged right into the story, almost unassimilated. But there's no need for it except to reverse engineer from the custom to come up with a new explanation for it.
Yeah. You'd call that an etiological myth,
Yep.
a myth that you write to explain some ritual you're already engaged in. A lot of the Bible is that. Like, they already had these rituals they were engaged in, and they just wrote stories to explain where these rituals originated. But the stories were invented after the rituals. The rituals came first, and then you made up stories. And the Passover story is an example of that.
Mm. And the whole thing with Moses being put into the Nile, borrowed from Sargon of Akkad and others. Why pick that origin story? Well, because they're trying to explain how Moses is, though it's obviously an Egyptian name like Tutmos and Ramesses and all that. No. It didn't seem fitting to a later readership that the father of the Hebrew religion had an Egyptian name. And so they said, well, is there a Hebrew word that sounds kind of like this that it could have been based on? Well, Moshe, well, there's the word masha, to draw out of. Well, suppose as an infant, his life was saved by his being drawn out of the river. And so, they named him that. And it's the whole thing is like a Shaggy Dog story leading to that. And, oh, okay. And so many of these stories are like that. It is absolutely fascinating.
All right, so there's one other line I wanted to ask about, where there's a part where Pharaoh says something to the effect of, if I were to free the slaves, it would have serious repercussions for our economy. Something like that.
Oh,
Yeah.
boy,
Yeah.
What did you guys think of that line in particular?
Well, it was a little anachronistic. They didn't really think of economics in those abstract terms like we do now. I mean, they could have had a conversation like that, but it wouldn't have been written in that kind of modern vernacular, I guess. Yeah, it was weird. It'd be bad for the economy. And Moses would okay, first of all, what's an economy? And secondly, how would it be bad? I don't understand. Explain this to me. I mean, they could have articulated reasons why it would be bad in a sense that we would call economically, but they would articulate the reasons. They wouldn't just say it's bad for the economy. That's a sentence that couldn't even have been uttered at that time, and concepts just weren't even there.
Yeah, he should have just said, who's going to do all the work? You expect us to do it? I mean, that would have been the issue.
Yeah, where's this money going to come from? Look, we can do math. We're good at math. Let's add up all these slaves, multiply it by a daily wage. Oh, that's a lot of money. That's going to come out of my pocket. Where's that going to come from? It would be in terms like that.
Because I guess the Bible story is that the pyramids were built by Jewish slave labor, but my understanding is that in actual history they were built by skilled craftsmen who were relatively well paid and well treated.
Well, it doesn't say they built the pyramids, despite the implication of the movie. It does say they built Pithom and Ramses, two storage cities, probably storing grain, and those were real cities. But that doesn't mean that.
Exodus actually mentions that they were making brick. That what their main task was making brick, and in fact, one of the ways that Pharaoh tries to punish the Jewish slaves is to make it harder for them to make brick by not supplying them with the materials to make brick and forcing them to go get the materials themselves. This is all in the book of Exodus. So what they were doing was brick making, and so your main building component, except for certain monumental architecture, was brick. So it was basically they were manufacturing your standard building material, which is really your bottom of the building. The building economy in that sense, but yeah, even then, bricklaying is a or not bricklaying, but manufacturing brick is not a simple skill. It is a craftsman skill. So I think they had a lot of slaves doing that, but you also had paid craftsmen doing that as well. So how it was in ancient Egypt, I'm not entirely sure, but that is they were very vague in the movie as to what the Jews were actually doing. They show lots of scenes of workers building stuff, but they never really clarify whether those are the Jews doing it or not. And when you see the Jews, they keep referring it as the quarries that Moses goes to visit. So that they're quarrying stone, but they never actually show them quarrying stone. So it's it's kind of wishy-washy. I don't know. They could have done more with that too, as well, I think.
That's a sign in Exodus that you're dealing with fiction. That the fact that Pharaoh has foremen, for instance, makes the obvious even more obvious, that he's got building plans that he wants carried out. He's not going to make it impossible for this to do the work just to spite him. That'd be insane. He's just a storybook villain, as is the case when he says he wants the 2 Hebrew midwives for a nation so big he's afraid they're going to overthrow his government. There are 2 of them, and he says, "Now I want you to kill the male babies as soon as they're born," as if they're going to get away with that one time. And then they say to him, "Well, sorry, we're trying, but the Hebrew women are so hardy and vigorous that they give birth before we can even get there. In other words, they don't use or need midwives. Well, then what the hell are you there for?" It's like if the Hebrews were all vegetarians, I'm the kosher butcher there. What the heck? And Colonel Klink, he believes it. I mean, it's obviously just mockery of the Pharaoh and so forth. There's no way this is history. It's incredible.
All right, so is there anything else you guys want to say about the parting of the Red Sea? I'll confess, I actually thought that was kind of awesome. I guess I have a weakness for cheesy sci-fi kind of stuff, as Richard was saying. But,
it was still better in the Charlton Heston version. It still looks pretty good, even today.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, visually it was great. I mean, scientifically it was not plausible at all. They tried to have it, they tried to make multiple scientific explanations of it, they make it look like a tsunami in a way, but tsunamis wouldn't behave that way. They have Moses sees a comet, or a meteorite, fly through the atmosphere and crash somewhere, but that's 12 hours before, so there's that can't possibly explain the tsunami. And then during the scene they show, you could see a whole bunch of tornadoes off in the distance, the tornadoes are conveniently sucking up all the water and then suddenly dropping it. I mean, these things make no sense at all.
I mean, what do you guys think about is the story of the parting of the Red Sea just a complete myth, or is it some exaggeration of something that could have actually happened?
Well, I think it's a complete myth myself. Certainly the way they describe it. In Exodus, they describe it as God sent a mighty wind that blew a column of water out of the sea and left a wall of water on the other side, and the Jews walked through. I mean, in terms of physics, the amount of wind that would require would have vaporized the bodies of the Jews. So obviously that's not scientifically realistic, but it made sense in terms of how the natural world was thought to work when the book was written, right? They thought wind would just blow the water out of the way. That makes sense. God just needs to send the right amount of wind. But there isn't any naturalistic explanation that does make sense. A tsunami wouldn't fit the description at all. Certainly not the description in the book of Exodus. And wouldn't fit what was shown in the movie either. If you know anything about tsunamis, it doesn't behave quite the way that it was shown in the movie. So once again, the movie was trying to straddle both lines. They're trying to have it almost like a tsunami, but almost miraculous. I didn't know what to do with it. But I don't personally think there's any rational explanation that would fit. It's just a wild myth.
Well, the good old Protestant rationalists who were a kind of a transitional form between Orthodox literalism and the Strauss myth position. These guys in the 18th and 19th centuries, and some still today, had this bizarre hybrid view that, all right, in a Newtonian world, there are no suspensions of natural law. So the supernaturalism, forget it. That's an insult to God. What, he didn't get it right when he was designing it the first time? He had to make mid-course corrections. So no, that's superstition. Nonetheless, everything the Bible says happened did happen. They just were in no position to know what was really going on, and we are. And so that generated often ridiculous pseudo-explanations, but there was one that is, as far as I know, conceivably possible if you insist that this happened. And of course, there's no reason to do that. But in historical times, there are attested a couple of instances where you had a temporary land bridge pop up because of seismic activity and gases expanding under the Earth's crust at a particular spot. And it's on record a couple of times. And after a while, the gases dissipated and the land bridge collapsed again. And so they said, well, maybe this is what happened. The Sinai volcano business indicates that there was this seismic problem and that the gases pushed a land bridge up long enough for the Hebrews to go over it. But while they were doing it, the gases were dissipating, and when the Egyptian chariots followed them, it collapsed. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous, but it would be a heck of a coincidence. Now, another interesting wrinkle in this is that the Exodus story is obviously, if you look at it closely, a patchwork, and there are indications that an earlier version of this had it not be that much of a miracle, because what they cross is not the Red Sea, but the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. In the Greek Septuagint, for some reason, the translators introduced the idea that it was the Red Sea. Well, the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, is obviously a marsh. And it says that the Israelites were heavily armed, though in the rest of the story you hear no more about it. And that when the Egyptian chariots tried to follow them, the wheels were clogged in the mud, and it implies that gave the armed Hebrews the advantage, and they won an upset victory. And so that you still find pretty pronounced traces of that, and then it got magnified more and more. Well, that doesn't mean anything actually happened, but there is evidence of an earlier, simpler, non-miraculous version. And so, that could have happened, but then you really got no movie.
Well, I think what would be interesting, because we know, like from Sun Tzu and some other ancient writers, that one of the tactics they recommend is to dam up a river, cross it, and then blow the dam at the key point to destroy your enemy. So you couldn't do that with the Red Sea, but you could do that with something like that. If you had some sort of river or something that you could cross, or a marshland that if you could get some sort of reservoir that you could flood the marsh suddenly. So you could have this military tactic as your rational explanation. That would be doable, but I don't see that as being plausible with the geography of the time.
Mm-hmm. There's a similar thing in Joshua where they carry the Ark of the Covenant over the Jordan dry shod. And just as in the Exodus thing, it actually does, as you pointed out, say a stiff east wind dried up the marsh. I mean, it's just providence, not miracle. In Joshua, it says that there was some kind of a rock slide upstream that temporarily stopped the Jordan and enabled them to cross. And then the water built up and knocked the rocks down, and the Jordan was restored. This is what the Bible actually says. It's astounding. Which implies, as many other things do, that these stories are much younger than we used to think, and that they may actually be reflections of some kind of Greek rationalism.
Well, I mean, Bob, you mentioned the Ten Commandments, and I thought that the very end of this movie really felt awkward to me. And I heard some people say it felt almost like a parody, but I can't see him chiseling the Ten Commandments without thinking of, Mel Brooks, or the Ark of the Covenant without thinking of Indiana Jones. I mean, did you guys have similar thoughts about the end of this movie?
Well, I one of the reviewers, I read some Christian reviews of it, and one of the Christian reviewers pointed out that in that final scene, because they like skip ahead like 20 years or whatever, and show Moses as an old man, and they're carrying the ark. Like, Moses is by himself in this wagon with the Ark of the Covenant supposedly behind him in the wagon. But as far as I understand, you're not supposed to carry the Ark of the Covenant in a wagon. You're supposed to carry it on poles on the arms of certain consecrated priests. So it doesn't like really track what Exodus describes. And of course, there's at no point in the movie, there's no pillar of smoke and fire leading the Israelites.
The tornadoes are supposed to be that. What's that? I think the tornadoes were.
Oh, you think? Yes, that makes sense. The sort of distant tornadoes during that one scene. Yeah. Right. Although you weren't supposed to run towards the tornadoes in that case.
Exactly.
It's not quite the same thing. So there's some anachronisms in terms of trying to display the text. But having that last scene, having Moses carve the Ten Commandments while the child just sort of is talking to him, possibly being hallucinated, who knows, that at least was consistent with their attempt to try and make Moses look like he was a schizophrenic hallucinating this child. But it did kind of like leave that sort of loose end, like, okay, that's where the movie ends. Like, there's a lot more to the book of Exodus than that scene. So it was just a strange place to end. But I think the idea would work. Like if they developed it a little better, of having Moses actually hallucinating this God telling him to write these things down. And so the tablets are actually being created by Moses and not by God. But then he comes down and says God wrote them. I mean, that would fit with their whole attempt to sort of naturalize it.
In Exodus 20, God writes them with his finger, but in Exodus 34, the other version of it, which they clumsily try to harmonize in the Bible with this thing with the golden calf and Moses smashing the tablets, God then says, come up and get another copy. But in fact, it's 7 of the commandments are entirely different. But at least in that one, this time it does not say God inscribed them. He dictated them to Moses. So they're kind of combining the two.
Yeah.
I mean, Richard, you mentioned Christian reactions. Are there other Christian reactions you read? Like, how are Christians or Jews reacting to this movie?
I didn't find any Jewish criticisms of it. I mean, I could have looked harder, I guess. I think this movie would be very disappointing for Jewish watchers because they cut out almost everything Jewish about it. And that, I think, would be kind of offensive, personally. But I mean, they do have the Jews being sort of, honorable, good, faithful people. But, that's the sort of a token throwaway to trying to, make the Jews look good rather than just actually honestly portray their history. Like the whole Passover story, I think, is so fundamental to the Jewish faith that to cut out the whole backstory of why the lamb's blood and all of that seemed like, why would you do that? So it's really a movie mainly created for Christians, I think. And maybe liberal Christians, I don't know. But the Christian reviewers I read said they didn't like all the things that were changed. They didn't like the fact that the Bible story wasn't followed exactly. They were very impressed by the plague scenes, whereas I found them boring, for an example. But it was mostly the idea of, it was offensive to portray Moses as maybe schizophrenic. It was offensive to portray God as a petulant little child. They didn't like that. So there are a lot of things that they did that I can understand why they would disappoint or offend Christian viewers. So it's again trying to toe that line of not offend or totally offend. You should have gone all one way or the other. It's trying to have it, I think, halfway makes friends of none, really.
Yeah.
Okay, so after Noah and now this one, I think both got pretty mixed receptions. What do you think the future is for Bible movies? Do you think they'll make some more? Do you think, are there any books of the Bible that you're really hoping to see?
Well, the book of Revelation, that would be mind-blowing. I think that would be terrific from anybody. Anybody watching that would just get a huge kick out of it. I think they ought to do that.
If it was done as written, yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be, you could do a really good surreal fantasy film on that, for sure. And people would freak out like that. This is the weirdest, this is the bizarrest stuff ever. This is the strangest Stanley Kubrick off the walls acid trip imaginable. Yeah, you could make something really great out of that. I always thought it would be interesting to see something like Genesis done without cutting out the horrible, weird stuff. Like actually have it displayed in there. Or do something like some of the Apocrypha would be fascinating. Like to do the Lilith story as it was written in Jewish lore. So there's lots of things that I think could be done, but I can't predict what will be done.
Oh, by the way, I gotta put in a plug for a book called Eden. It is just fascinating with the it's very poetic, and it's almost centers around Lilith, and it's such a scathing treatment of religion as a kind of a substitute for God, and the way it led to priestcraft and the oppression of women and so forth. And yet it's a poetic treatment. It's really astonishing. And it's been out of print for decades, and soon it'll be available again. I believe the author's last name, oh, wait a minute, is it? Oh, boy, I'm forgetting now. But it's called Eden, and I'll probably be putting it up on my website. But I'm sure you'd enjoy that, and a lot of people would.
Okay, well, actually, while we're at this, why don't you just give us your website, Bob, so people can go look at it?
It's not up yet, but will be shortly. It's robertmprice.mindvendor with an O-R, mindvendor.com.
All right, cool. So we should start wrapping this up pretty soon. I did want to give you guys a chance to talk about some of the stuff that you've been up to. So, I mean, like Richard, last time we had you on the show, your book on the historicity of Jesus was, I think, a few months out from publication.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you just sort of catch us up on what's been going on with that since then?
Oh, yeah. That was published by the University of Sheffield last June. And I've been actually touring the U.S. and Canada, talking about it, having a few formal debates with professors and other experts on the subject. So it's been very interesting. We're still developing more academic attention and interaction for next year and the year after that. So it's getting a lot of interest, and it's being well received so far. We'll see how things go with that.
Have any of those debates brought up anything that you didn't already know or that gave you pause or anything like that?
No, not really. People get more and more desperate to try and find verses in the epistles of Paul. Now that I've addressed all the ones that they usually try to use to prove that Jesus existed, and they collapse on analysis when you look at them closely in context. So now they realize those are a wash. So there's more effort to try and pour through the scriptures, as of Paul's epistles, to try and find any verse they can cling to as indicating historicity. And they've found like one or two that you could sort of spin that way, but only in the most elaborate, Rube Goldberg-esque way. Whereas when you look at them again, you look at them, stand back and look at them in context, you say, well, this actually makes just as much sense, if not more sense, on the theory that Jesus began as a revelatory being and was only historicized later. So there's just been like two verses like that, but they don't really give me much pause, because you can immediately see, oh, that makes perfect sense on the revelatory being hypothesis. You don't even need a historical Jesus to explain that verse. And I think it's a lot of that is people are so used to reading the Bible with the assumption of a historical Jesus that they can't switch rails and get onto the idea of, let's look at the text with, the completely different perspective. Let's assume that Jesus began as a revelatory being, and that's the only way Paul knew Jesus, or any of the first Christians knew Jesus. Look at it from that mindset, and you'll be blown away at how different and how interesting the epistles of Paul become. Like the meaning of a lot of things he says changes in important ways, which I think is the importance of this theory, because I think this theory might actually be true. I think it's more likely than not the case. And so it actually transforms the way we understand earliest Christian literature, what the first Christians believed, what Paul actually meant in various verses, what the Christian religion was about, why it was created, what was the purpose of it socially. You changes your perspective. So there's a lot of, there's importance to it from the perspective of understanding our own history. It's not just a debate over whether Jesus existed or not. It really changes the way we understand the formation of Christianity itself in important ways.
And so the book is called On the Historicity of Jesus by Richard Carrier. And why don't you give us your website too, Richard?
Yeah, everything about me, all my work and everything, you can find books and all on it. www.richardcarrier.info, info. And also you can find on my About page there. I'm also teaching monthly online courses in both ancient history, biblical history, and philosophy. Every month I teach one course, so if people are interested in following up with that, you could find info there about it.
All right, great. And so, Bob, also a couple months ago, you emailed me about this book by Earl Wunderly that you said was really good. I was just wondering if you wanted to say a bit about that, tell people about it.
Yeah, that is one heck of a fascinating book. It's called An Imperfect Book, which is taken from some Joseph Smith quote. And he shows simply from internal analysis of the Book of Mormon how it is absolutely clear from writing styles, the looking at the foreign names and how they don't really reflect any ancient Hebrew culture, but are obviously coinages by somebody with a limited and repetitive imagination. Sorts of ways, just sticking with the text of the Book of Mormon, how it has to be a modern fictional work by a single author, and with techniques and arguments I would never have thought of. It's just brilliant. And the guy is, I think, a lawyer and a statistician or something, but it's just endlessly fascinating and nails the mummy case shut, I think.
All right, and then I'd also want to, throw in a recommendation for Bob's The Bible Geek podcast, which, as I've said before, is just one of my favorite podcasts. I listen all the time. It's just great. But yeah, so we've gone on pretty long, so I think we should start wrapping this up right here. But so we've been speaking with Richard Carrier and Robert M. Price. So guys, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Robert M. Price and Richard Carrier for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Hugh B. Long in Canada, who writes, "A writer's best friend. I stumbled on the podcast a few months ago, and have since been devouring all the old episodes. Like other listeners have mentioned, the author interviews are fantastic. I'm discovering all kinds of new fiction that I might otherwise have passed on. As a writer, the show is a goldmine for ideas and concepts, as well as inspiration. Keep up the great work, guys and gals. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy rocks." So big thanks again to Hugh B. Long for that great review. And of course, a very special thank you to all of our crowdfunders, including Laura Dirks, Jonathan Geloni, Zoe Akim, Joanna Evans, George Turcotte, and Vlad Levin. So thanks, guys. We really appreciate it. To learn more, visit us at geeksguideshow.com and click on crowdfunding. All right, so that concludes Season 5 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next year.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.